If you ever find something glowing in the dirt, don't assume it's dead. The wind dragged cold dust across Ethan Cole's boots as he stood in the middle of his empty field, shovel buried halfway into the ground, staring at the thing he'd just uncovered. It wasn't metal, wasn't rock, and it sure as hell wasn't anything that belonged on his farm, because it breathed, slow, uneven, like it had forgotten how. The glow beneath its skin pulsed faint blue, flickering like a dying lantern. And for a moment, he almost walked away, because he'd seen what came from the sky before. And none of it had ever brought anything back. But then it moved, just enough to make his grip tighten, and a sound slipped out, soft and broken, not a threat, not even a warning, just a voice trying to exist. Ethan exhaled slowly, the cold air burning his lungs, and knelt anyway, because that's what he did, even when it didn't make sense anymore, even when there was no one left to tell him it was the right thing. He brushed the dirt away, careful without knowing why, and that's when he saw her face, not human, not exactly, but close enough to make something in his chest hesitate. Her eyes snapped open, bright, unnatural, locking onto his like she'd been waiting for that exact moment. And for a second neither of them moved. "Are you going to kill me?" she asked, voice raw, like the words heard on the way out. And Ethan felt something twist deep in his gut, because he'd asked that same question once, years ago, to something that never answered. The wind picked up, rattling the loose panels of his barn in the distance. And he looked at her, really looked this time, at the light leaking through her skin, at the way her hands trembled like she didn't understand gravity. And he knew exactly what she was, or at least what she belonged to, and every instinct he had told him to step back, to leave her there, to let the cold take care of the rest like it had taken everything else. But instead, he reached for the worn jacket off his shoulders and dropped it over her without a word. She flinched at the contact, like kindness was something unfamiliar, and he didn't explain, didn't justify it, just stood up and turned away, because if he stayed looking at her any longer, he might remember too much. Behind him, the faint glow steadied, just a little, and the field, empty for so long, didn't feel quite as silent anymore. The first thing she noticed was the heat, not the warmth of comfort, but the controlled, steady kind that came from a small metal heater humming in the corner, its orange coils glowing like a miniature sun. She sat on the edge of Ethan's worn couch, the oversized jacket still wrapped around her shoulders, fingers brushing the rough fabric as if trying to understand it, while across the room he moved in silence, boots heavy against the wooden floor, setting a dented pot onto the stove with practiced motions that did not ask for permission or attention. The air smelled faintly of dust and something earthy, something alive, and it confused her more than the cold outside ever could. "You should not have touched me," she said finally, voice steadier now, but still carrying that strange echo, as if it came from somewhere deeper than her throat. And Ethan did not turn, just poured water into the pot and lit the burner with a soft click. "You were freezing," he replied, simple, like that. Was the only fact that mattered, and she tilted her head slightly, watching him the way one studies a phenomenon that does not follow known laws. "My kind does not freeze," she said, almost correcting him, and he shrugged, finally glancing back, eyes tired but sharp. "Looked like you were doing a pretty good impression of it." And for a moment something flickered across her expression, not anger, not quite confusion, something softer that she did not name. The light beneath her skin pulsed. Again, a little stronger now, casting faint blue reflections across the walls, and Ethan noticed but did not react, just stirred the pot slowly, as if glowing strangers in his living room were no longer surprising. She stood, unsteady at first, the floor unfamiliar beneath her bare feet, and took a cautious step forward, then another, the jacket slipping slightly as she moved. Her gaze fixed on him like he was the unstable element in the room. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, and this time there was no edge, just a quiet weight behind the question, and Ethan paused, spoon hovering over the pot, because there were 100 answers he could have given, reasons buried under years of silence and loss, but none of them felt right in his mouth. So he did what he always did. He chose the smallest truth, the one that did not require explanation. "Because I can," he said, setting the spoon down and grabbing a chipped bowl from the counter. And she watched that simple action as if it carried more meaning than any declaration, her fingers tightening slightly around the fabric of his jacket. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, a low, constant reminder of the empty world beyond. But inside, the space between them shifted, something unseen adjusting. And for the first time since she had opened her eyes in the dirt, she did not look at him like a threat, but like a question she was not sure she wanted answered. The bowl was still warm in her hands when the silence stretched too long, not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar, like a space that expected something to fill it but did not demand it. She sat at the small wooden table, watching the steam rise in thin spirals, studying it as if it held answers, while Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed, eyes drifting toward the window where the fields lay dark and empty under a pale sky. "Your world is quiet," she said after a while, and he let out a slow breath through his nose, something close to a humorless smile touching his lips. "It did not used to be," he replied, voice low, like he was speaking to something that was not there anymore. She looked up at him then, really looked, the way she had begun to do more often, noticing the lines in his face that did not come from age alone, the way his shoulders carried weight that had nothing to do with work, and the way his eyes avoided the horizon as if it held memories instead of distance. "What happened to it?" she asked, and for a moment the heater hummed louder, or maybe everything else just went quiet. Ethan pushed off the counter, walked to the table, and set another piece of bread beside her bowl, his movements steady, controlled, like every action had been measured long before this moment. "Same thing that happens to most things," he said, not meeting her gaze. It ran out of time. And she felt something shift again, deeper this time, something that resonated with a frequency she had spent centuries ignoring. Her fingers tightened slightly around the bowl, the blue light beneath her skin dimming for a brief second, reacting not to danger, but to something else entirely. "My kind does not run out of time," she said quietly, and Ethan nodded once, like he had expected that answer. "Yeah," he replied, finally sitting across from her, elbows resting on the table. "I figured," and there was no resentment in his voice, not openly, but something underneath it, something restrained, like a storm held behind glass. She watched him closely now, analyzing, comparing, trying to reconcile the data in front of her with everything she knew, because none of it aligned. Not his behavior, not his tone, not the fact that he had every reason to turn her away and had not. "You know what I am," she said, not a question this time, and Ethan's eyes flicked up to meet hers, steady and unflinching. "I know what came from the sky," he answered, and that was enough. The room seemed to tighten around that truth, the air heavier, the light from her skin reflecting in his eyes, and for the first time since she had woken in the dirt, she felt something that was not confusion or calculation, but hesitation. "And you still chose to help," she said, softer now, and Ethan leaned back slightly, gaze drifting to the side like he was looking at something only he could see. "Choosing not to would not change anything," he said after a moment, voice quiet but firm. "It would just make one more thing worse." And the simplicity of it struck her harder than any force she had ever known, because it was not logic, not strategy, not survival. It was something else entirely, something her kind had never needed to understand. The heater clicked, softly as it cycled, the only sound in the room, and she lowered her gaze to the bowl in her hands, the warmth seeping into her skin, into whatever part of her still felt, and for the first time in a very long existence, she did not feel above the being in front of her. She felt seen, and she did not know what to do with that. The night settled slowly over the farm, not with darkness, but with a kind of quiet that pressed against the windows and seeped into the walls, and Ethan stood on the porch with his hands resting on the wooden railing, staring out across the fields that no longer grew anything but memory. Behind him, the door creaked open, soft and uncertain, and she stepped outside, the faint blue light beneath her skin barely visible now, dimmed to something almost human, almost fragile. The air was colder, here, sharper, and she paused as if measuring it, as if deciding whether she belonged in it at all. "You come out here every night," she said, her voice carrying easily through the stillness, and Ethan did not turn, just nodded once, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky met the empty land. "It used to mean something," he replied, and she followed his gaze, searching for whatever he saw, but there was nothing there. just distance and silence. She moved closer, slow, deliberate steps that made no sound on the worn wood, until she stood beside him, close enough to feel the faint heat from his body, something steady and grounded in a way she could not replicate. "You are waiting," she said, more certain this time, and Ethan let out a quiet breath that fogged in the cold air. "No," he answered after a moment. "I stopped waiting a long time ago." And yet he did not move, did not go back inside, did not look away. She tilted her head slightly, studying him again, the contradictions, stacking one on top of another, because everything about him defied efficiency, defied logic, defied the patterns she had known for so long. "Your kind continues to act against its own survival," she said, not as judgment, but as observation. And this time he did turn, just enough to glance at her, a faint line forming between his brows. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe we just decide some things matter more." And the words lingered in the space between them, heavier than they should have been. She looked down at her hands, at the faint glow that pulsed beneath the surface, weaker now, quieter, responding not to power but to proximity. And for the first time, she felt something she could not quantify, something that did not fit into any structure she had been built to understand. "If I told you that I was the reason your world became this," she said slowly, each word deliberate, like placing pieces into a pattern she feared to complete, "what would you do?" And the wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and distant metal, and Ethan's jaw tightened, just barely, the only sign that the words had landed where they were meant to. He looked back out over the fields, not answering right away, not reacting the way she expected, because she had seen countless beings respond to truth with immediate action, with instinct, with consequence. But he did none of those things. Instead, he rested his hands more firmly on the railing, fingers curling around the worn wood, grounding himself in something simple and real. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, and impossibly controlled. "I would ask if you are done being that person." And the question hit her harder than any accusation, because it was not about the past, not about punishment or justification. It was about something else entirely. Something forward, something that required a choice. She stared at him, the faint light in her eyes flickering, uncertain for the first time, not because of weakness, but because she did not know the answer, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something neither of them had the words for yet. The silence stayed with them long after the question settled, stretching between the porch and the empty fields like something alive, and she did not move, did not look away. Because for the first time in her existence the answer was not immediate, not calculated, not inevitable. "I do not know," she said finally, and the words felt unfamiliar, heavier than any declaration she had ever made, and Ethan nodded once, not in approval, not in disappointment, just acknowledgement, like uncertainty was. Something he understood better than certainty. The wind shifted again, colder now, and he pushed himself off the railing, stepping back toward the door. "Then you stay until you figure it out," he said, simple, as if it was already decided, and she watched him, the ease of that decision confusing her more than anything else, because there was no condition, no demand, no attempt to control the outcome. "You would allow that?" she asked, following him inside, the door closing softly behind them, sealing out the night, and he shrugged slightly, moving to adjust the heater, turning the dial with a small click. "It is not about what I allow," he replied, glancing at her briefly. "It is about what you choose to do next." And again, he placed the weight back on her, not as a burden, but as something she had never been given before. She stood near the doorway, the faint blue glow beneath her skin flickering with each breath, reacting not to threat, but to the unfamiliar rhythm of choice. And her gaze drifted across the room, taking in the small details she had overlooked before, the worn edges of the table, the repaired cracks in the wall, the way everything in this place had been broken at some point and still remained. "Your world is damaged," she said quietly, and Ethan let out a soft exhale, something between agreement and resignation. "Yeah," he answered, "but it is still here." And the distinction lingered, subtle but significant. She moved further into the room, her steps more stable now, her presence less like an intrusion and more like something gradually finding its place, though she did not understand how or why. "Where I come from," she began, her voice lowering slightly. Damage is removed, erased, replaced with something more efficient. And Ethan paused in his movement, one hand resting on the back of a chair, considering that for a moment before responding. Sounds clean, he said, but not very human. And she looked at him again, that word carrying more meaning now than it had before. No longer just a classification, but something layered, something contradictory, and persistent. And what does it mean to be human? She asked, stepping closer. The question no longer clinical but searching, and Ethan leaned back slightly against the table, arms crossing loosely, eyes studying her. With a quiet intensity. It means you keep going even when it does not make sense, he said. It means you take what is broken and you try anyway. And the simplicity of it struck her again, not because it was complex, but because it was not, because it required something her kind had never prioritized. She lowered her gaze, looking at her hands once more, the light beneath her skin steady now, no longer erratic, but not strong either, something in between, something changing, and for a moment, she imagined what it would mean to remain here, not as what she had been, but as something else, something undefined. And if I cannot become that, she said quietly, almost to herself, if I remain what I was, and Ethan did not hesitate this time, his voice firm but not harsh, then you decide what that means from here on. He answered, and the room fell quiet again. But it was a different kind of silence now, not empty, not uncertain, but filled with the weight of a choice that had not yet been made. And for the first time, she did not fear that. Morning came without ceremony, just a slow gray light spilling through the thin curtains and settling across the floor, and Ethan was already outside, boots pressing into the dry soil as he checked the irrigation lines that had not carried water in months, his movements steady, repetitive, like the act itself still mattered even if the result did not. Behind him, the door opened quietly, and she stepped out into the cool air, pausing as the light touched her skin, the faint blue glow beneath it, hovering just above the surface, sensing what remained, what had been lost, and what could still be altered, because she knew how to fix this, not with effort, not with time, but with a single act of will, something her kind would have done without hesitation, without question. The energy within her stirred at the thought, a quiet pull toward restoration, toward correction, toward making the broken whole again. And for a moment she almost did it, almost reached down and changed everything. But she stopped, her hand freezing in place just inches above the ground. You could restore this, she said instead, not looking at him, her voice lower now, more uncertain than before, and Ethan straightened slowly, wiping his hands against his jeans, studying her with a look that was not surprised, not hopeful, just careful. Could you? He asked, and she nodded slightly, the faint light in her eyes flickering as the possibility hung between them, bright and immediate. Then why do not you? He said, and it was not a challenge, not an accusation, just a question, and she finally looked up at him, meeting his gaze fully, because this was the moment that defined everything, the line between what she had always been and what she might become. Because I do not know if it would be right, she admitted, the words slow, deliberate, and the admission itself felt like stepping into something unknown. The wind moved through the field, carrying dust and silence with it, and Ethan watched her. For a long second before speaking, his voice quiet but steady. Then maybe you are starting to understand. And something in her shifted again, not power, not control, but perspective, something that reshaped the way she saw the ground beneath her, the man in front of her, and herself. She lowered her hand, letting it rest at her side, the urge to fix, to erase, to perfect fading into something else, something that required patience instead of force. And for the first time, she chose not to act. Not because she could not, but because she was not certain she should. Ethan nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then turned back to the irrigation line, adjusting a loose connection with the same care as before, as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had, because behind him, she remained still, watching, learning, and choosing in a way she never had before, and the field, though still barren, no longer felt entirely beyond saving. By late afternoon the sky shifted, not in color but in weight, a subtle pressure that settled over the land like something unseen had arrived before anything visible could follow. and Ethan felt it before he saw it, his hands pausing mid-motion as he tightened a loose valve, eyes lifting slowly toward the horizon. She noticed it too, though not with her eyes, but with something deeper, something that resonated through her very being, a distant signal, familiar and impossible to ignore, and for the first time since she had stepped onto this world, the faint light beneath her skin pulsed sharply, brightening for a brief second before settling again. "They are searching," she said quietly, her voice carrying a tone Ethan had not heard before, something closer to certainty than question, and he straightened, wiping his hands against his jeans as he followed her gaze toward the empty sky. "Who is?" he asked, though part of him already understood the answer. She did not respond immediately, her focus fixed on something far beyond the clouds, something only she could perceive, and when she finally spoke, it was with a calm that felt heavier than fear. "Those who remain loyal to what I was," and the words settled between them with a quiet finality. Ethan exhaled slowly, not in surprise, not even in frustration, just acknowledgement, because of course something like her would not simply disappear without consequence. And of course that consequence would eventually find its way here. "And what happens when they find you?" he asked, his voice steady, his posture unchanged, and she turned to look at him, really look this time, as if measuring something she had not needed to measure before. "They will expect me to return," she said, "to resume what was left unfinished." And Ethan nodded once, the meaning clear without needing further explanation. The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the field in a low, constant sweep. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the next part did not require words, only choice. "And will you?" he asked after a moment, not demanding, not pushing, just placing the question where it belonged. She held his gaze, the faint glow in her eyes flickering, not from instability, but from conflict, something she was still learning to navigate. "I do not know," she admitted again, but this time it sounded different, less like uncertainty and more like deliberation, and Ethan accepted that with the same quiet nod as before. "Then we deal with it when it gets here," he said simply, turning back toward the irrigation line as if the approaching unknown did not change the work in front of him, as if the present still mattered more than the inevitable. She watched him, the simplicity of his response settling into her thoughts, reshaping them in ways she did not yet fully understand, because where she came from, uncertainty demanded immediate resolution, decisive action, but here, it was allowed to exist, to unfold, to be lived through rather than erased. The light beneath her skin steadied again, softer now, controlled not by instinct but by intention, and she turned her gaze back to the sky, sensing the distant presence drawing closer, not yet visible, not yet immediate, but no longer abstract. For the first time, she did not feel the pull to answer it, not as she once would have, not as something inevitable, but as something she could choose to face differently, and beside her, Ethan continued his work, the quiet rhythm of his actions grounding the moment in something real, something tangible, something worth holding on to, even as the unseen moved closer across the vast, empty distance. The sky did not break, it simply changed, the pale gray thinning into something too smooth, too still, like a surface stretched over something vast and watching. And Ethan noticed it when the wind stopped entirely, the sudden absence louder than any storm. He stood in the middle of the field, shoulders squared, eyes fixed upward as a faint shimmer rippled across the clouds, barely visible unless you knew where to look, and beside him she stepped forward, the light beneath her skin rising. Again, not uncontrolled, but undeniable now, responding to something that had finally arrived. "They are here," she said, her voice quieter than before, not from fear, but from the weight of recognition, and Ethan nodded once, slow, deliberate, like he had already decided something long before this moment came. The air pressed down, not physically, but with a presence that filled the space, and the shimmer above them shifted, resolving into something more defined, something vast and distant, like a reflection that did not belong to the sky. And though no sound followed, the message came all the same, not spoken, not heard, but understood. She closed her eyes for a brief second, her posture straightening, the faint uncertainty that had lingered within her beginning to settle into something clearer, something sharper, and when she opened them again, The blue light was steady, calm, no longer flickering between states, but holding its ground. "They are calling me back," she said, and Ethan did not ask what that meant, did not question the implication, because he already knew. Instead, he looked out across the field one more time, at the cracked soil, the broken lines of irrigation, the quiet evidence of something that had not given up despite every reason to. And then he looked at her. "And what are you going to tell them?" he asked, his voice even, not demanding, not guiding, just placing the choice exactly where it belonged. She hesitated, not because she lacked the answer, but because for the first time, the answer was not dictated by what she was, but by what she chose to be, and the weight of that settled deeper than any command she had ever followed. The presence above them pulsed again, more insistent now, the call sharpening, narrowing, expecting compliance, expecting return, expecting the continuation of something that had once been absolute. She lifted her gaze toward the sky, feeling it, understanding it, and then slowly, deliberately, she shook her head. "No," she said, not loudly, not defiantly, but with a quiet certainty that carried further than any force. And the air seemed to hold that word for a moment, as if the world itself needed to process it. Beside her, Ethan did not move, did not react beyond a small shift in his stance, but something in his expression softened, just slightly, like a tension he had not acknowledged had eased. The shimmer above them lingered, unmoving, unreadable, and for a moment it felt like the entire sky was waiting, recalculating, adjusting to a response it had not anticipated. She lowered her gaze again, looking not at the horizon, not at the sky, but at the ground beneath her feet, the same ground she could have restored, could have remade, could have reshaped into something flawless, and instead, she remained still, choosing to stand in what was broken rather than erase it. "Then they will come closer," she said quietly, not as a warning, but as a fact, and Ethan nodded once, the same way he always did, accepting what was in front of him without trying to rewrite it. "Then we will be here," he replied, and the simplicity of that answer settled into the moment like something unshakable, something that did not need to be louder to be stronger. And for the first time, as the presence above them adjusted to her refusal, she did not feel alone in the choice she had just made. The sky did not descend, and nothing dramatic followed her refusal, but something changed all the same, subtle and undeniable, like a decision echoing across a distance too vast to measure, and the pressure that had settled over the field began to ease, not disappearing, but loosening, as if whatever watched from above was no longer certain of its next move. Ethan remained where he was, boots planted in the dry soil, his gaze steady but no longer fixed on the sky, because the moment had already passed, and what mattered now was what came after it. Beside him, she stood in silence, the light beneath her skin calm, no longer reactive, no longer pulled between two states, but anchored, as if the choice she had made had finally given it direction. "They are reconsidering," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of something new, not relief, not triumph, but something closer to understanding, and Ethan nodded once, glancing briefly upward before looking back out over the field. "Good," he replied simply as if the reaction of something beyond the sky was no more important than the ground beneath his feet. The wind returned slowly, brushing across the land in a soft, steady sweep, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and something else, something almost forgotten, and she noticed it immediately, her gaze dropping to the soil where a single, fragile sprout pushed through the cracked surface, barely visible, barely alive, but there. She stepped closer, crouching slightly, her eyes fixed on it. And for a moment the instinct returned, the urge to reach out, to accelerate its growth, to transform it into something strong and immediate. But she stopped, her hand hovering just above it before lowering again. Ethan walked up beside her, following her gaze, and when he saw it, he did not smile, did not react with surprise, just nodded once, like he had expected something like this all along. "Takes time," he said, his voice quiet but certain, and she looked up at him, that word settling. Differently now, no longer a limitation, but a process. "I could make it grow," she said, not as an offer, but as a statement of fact, and Ethan met her gaze, steady and unchanging. "I know," he replied. But then it would not be this. And she understood what he meant, not fully, not completely, but enough. The sprout trembled slightly in the breeze, fragile and imperfect, and yet it remained. Not because it was made to, but because it chose to, in the only way it could. She stood slowly, the faint light within her dimming to match the world around her rather than overpower it. And for the first time, she did not feel the need to rise above it. The sky above cleared gradually, the unnatural smoothness breaking apart into something more familiar, more uncertain, and whatever had watched from beyond withdrew, not defeated, not gone, but no longer pressing against the edges of this place. They will not stop, she said after a moment, her gaze lifting once more, and Ethan shrugged, slightly, hands resting at his sides. Neither will we, he answered, and there was no defiance in it, no grand declaration, just a quiet truth that did not need to be louder to be real. She looked at him then. Really looked, not as something lesser, not as something temporary, but as something enduring in a way her kind had never needed to be, and slowly, almost unconsciously, she lowered her head, not in submission, not in weakness, but in acknowledgement. The wind moved through the field again, carrying the faint rustle of something beginning, and Ethan turned back toward the house, his steps steady, familiar, as if nothing had changed. And yet everything had. Behind him, she remained for a moment. Longer, watching the small green sprout against the vast emptiness. And then she followed, her presence no longer an intrusion, but a part of something still becoming. And in the quiet space between